I always loved how quiet the forest was. The way the trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out the rest of the world, made me feel safe. I often hiked through these woods alone, enjoying the peace, the occasional rustling of leaves, and the soft crunch of sticks under my boots. This time felt the same. I packed light, just a small backpack with some water and snacks. My plan was to take the long trail, circle the lake, and be back before dark. I started early, just as the sun was coming up, casting long shadows on the ground. The further I went, the narrower the trail got. The trees grew closer together, their branches stretching out like they were trying to touch the sky. The air was cool, but the sweat on my back reminded me that I was putting in some work. I noticed that the usual sounds of the forest, birds singing, the wind moving through the leaves, started to fade away, leaving a strange, heavy silence. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was all in my head. But as I kept walking, the feeling that something wasn't right just wouldn't go away. The trail, which I knew so well, started to feel unfamiliar. It twisted and turned in ways I didn't remember. I told myself to stay calm, but the uneasy feeling kept growing. When I reached the lake, I hoped that seeing the water would help me relax. But the lake looked wrong too. The water was completely still, too still. No ripples, no signs of life. Just a flat, dark surface that seemed to suck in the light. I stood there, staring at it, trying to figure out what was bothering me. That's when I realized the silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just a heavy, uncomfortable quiet. A sound behind me made me jump, a soft crack, like a twig breaking. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't come again. I forced myself to calm down, took a deep breath, and decided it was time to head back. The forest was just playing tricks on me, I told myself. I just needed to get back to the start of the trail. But the way back wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. The trail seemed to change, like it was leading me in circles. I started walking faster, trying to stay calm, but my heart was pounding in my chest. The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I eventually broke into a jog, desperate to find a way out. The trail had to end soon, I just had to keep going. But no matter how far I ran, the forest didn't change. The same twisted trees, the same suffocating silence. Then I saw it, a small clearing up ahead, an open space between the trees. Relief washed over me, and I ran toward it, desperate to get out of the thick woods. But when I broke through the trees, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was the same lake. I stared at the water, my mind racing. I had run in a straight line, or at least I thought I had. But here I was, back at the same spot. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows over the water. My throat was dry, and my hands shook as I tried to make sense of it. I turned back to the trees, trying to decide what to do next. But something caught my eye, a movement in the corner of my vision. I whipped around, my heart pounding. At first, I saw nothing, just the same trees and underbrush. But then, in the distance, I noticed something, or someone, standing among the trees. A dark shape, barely visible in the fading light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. Panic surged through me. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the figure. But when I glanced over my shoulder to find another way out, I saw it again, closer this time, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It didn't make sense. I spun around, but there it was again, on the other side of the lake. No matter where I looked, it was there, getting closer. I realized then that I wasn't getting out of this forest. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there wasn't one. The trees seemed to close in around me, trapping me in this nightmare. I couldn't run, couldn't hide. The figure was everywhere, and deep down, I knew I wasn't going to leave this forest. The last bit of sunlight slipped below the horizon, leaving the forest in darkness. I stood there, frozen, knowing that whatever was out there would come for me. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. And then, in that final moment, as the darkness swallowed me, I understood. The forest had never been a place of safety. It had been waiting until I was alone, vulnerable. There was no way out. The forest had claimed me, and I knew with a sickening certainty that whatever was out there wasn't going to let me go. The darkness seemed to grow heavier, pressing in on me, and I felt a cold, sharp fear in my chest. The forest didn't just take me, it trapped me, leaving me alone in the dark forever. I decided to take a weekend trip up into the mountains, wanting some time alone in nature. The drive up was peaceful, with the trees getting thicker the higher I went. I finally found a place to park near the start of a trail and began walking, eager to leave all the noise behind. The trail was overgrown and hardly used, which was perfect. I felt free as I moved deeper into the forest, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves under my feet and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. After a couple of hours, I found a small open space and decided it was a good spot to set up camp. I set up my tent and gathered some wood for a fire. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, but I wasn't worried. I had camped alone before and knew what I was doing. I lit the fire, cooked some dinner, and sat back, enjoying the quiet. As night fell, the forest around me got darker, with the thick trees blocking out most of the moonlight. The fire was my only light, its glow making the surrounding woods seem even darker. I stared into the flames, letting my mind drift, until a sudden crack in the wood snapped me out of it. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just a branch falling, maybe an animal moving around. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Another crack, followed by the sound of something moving through the bushes. My heart started to pound as I listened closely, trying to figure out what it was. The noise got louder, and whatever it was definitely getting closer. My mind raced, thinking of all the possibilities. It could be a bear, maybe a mountain lion. Both were known to live around here. But something felt wrong. The way it was moving was too steady, almost like it was following a path, coming right toward me. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees, the light cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just endless rows of trees, but then, just at the edge of the light, I saw someone. It was a person, standing completely still, staring back at me. I froze, unsure of what to do. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, half hidden in the shadows. My first thought was to call out, but something told me not to. Instead, I slowly stepped back, keeping the light on them. Suddenly, they stepped forward, coming fully into view. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden in the shadows. He didn't say anything, didn't do anything, just stood there, watching me. My mind screamed at me to run, to get as far away from him as possible, but my body wouldn't move. Then, without any warning, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, frozen with fear, before my survival instincts kicked in. I quickly packed up my stuff, my hands shaking as I tried to put out the fire and gather my gear. I didn't bother taking down the tent. I just grabbed my backpack and flashlight and took off down the trail, moving as fast as I could in the dark. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him following me, but the trail stayed empty. I pushed myself to keep going, ignoring the burning in my legs and the pain in my side. I just needed to get back to my car, to get out of this forest. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the start of the trail up ahead, my car just beyond it. Relief washed over me as I reached it, but that relief didn't last long. As I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door with trembling hands, I heard something behind me. The same steady footsteps I had heard earlier. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see him again. I threw open the door, jumped inside, and locked it. The car roared to life, and I sped out of there, tires kicking up gravel as I raced down the mountain road. Even once I was miles away, back on the highway, the fear didn't leave me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting in the back seat. I never went back to that forest. Something about that night, about the way he just stood there, watching me, felt wrong. Like I wasn't just some random person who wandered into the woods, but someone he had been waiting for. Like he was out there, watching for someone else to come along. And that thought, more than anything, kept me far away from the woods, knowing that sometimes, the most dangerous thing out there isn't what you expect, it's the person you never see coming. The thought of him still being out there, waiting for someone else to show up, keeps me awake at night, because I know that next time, it could be someone who doesn't get away. I started my hike in the forest at sunrise, on a trail I'd walked many times before. The trees were thick, and the usual morning fog clung to the ground. It was a beautiful day, but the silence felt strange, almost too quiet. Around midday, I decided to try a different path, lured by the idea of seeing something new. The trail was less traveled, and I soon saw odd marks on the trees, scratches that seemed too intentional to be from animals. I felt uneasy and thought about turning back, but curiosity got the better of me. By late afternoon, the forest was getting darker as the trees overhead grew thicker. My phone's GPS had lost signal, and the sun was starting to disappear behind the trees. I thought I could find my way back, but the unfamiliar area was confusing. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, but every time I looked around, nothing was there. I remembered a shortcut from a map I had seen before, hoping it would take me back to a known spot. The path became narrower and more twisted, and I started feeling more anxious. My heart raced as I pushed through thorny bushes and over fallen logs. The forest felt stifling, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. As it grew darker, I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was an old, abandoned campsite. The fire pit was cold and empty, but what caught my attention was a large, filthy backpack lying next to it. The straps were frayed, and it looked like it had been there for a long time. I approached it carefully, my heart pounding. Inside the backpack were a few items: a worn-out map, a broken compass, and a notebook. I flipped through the notebook and saw it was filled with desperate notes about getting lost and being followed. The last entry was from just a few days ago and mentioned someone, or something, tracking the writer. Panic hit me hard. I realized I wasn't alone. I felt like something was watching me, stalking my every move. I quickly put the items back into the backpack and fled from the clearing. My only thought was to get out of the forest before it got completely dark. I pushed through the dense underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps and my heart racing. Eventually, I found a more familiar part of the trail and made it back to the main path just as night fell. When I reached my car, I was drained and terrified. Driving home, I felt a chilling sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching me was still out there, following me even as I left. The thought of that presence, waiting for me to return to the forest, haunted me. I knew then that whatever was in those woods was real, and it was not done with me yet. I vowed never to wander off the path again, but deep down, I feared that it wouldn't be the last I saw of whatever was lurking in the darkness. I was hiking through a thick forest that seemed to go on forever, far from any towns or roads. All I could hear was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant sounds of birds. I had planned this trip to get away from everything, just to spend a few days by myself, away from all the noise and stress of life. By the second day, the trees all started to look the same. Tall, dark trunks with thick branches that blocked out most of the sunlight. My map wasn't very helpful. The trails were barely marked, and I started to feel like I was going in circles. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt, thick with the smell of wet moss and dirt. After some time, I came across what looked like an old, overgrown path. It wasn't on my map, but I thought it might lead to something interesting, maybe a hidden spot or an old campsite. The path was narrow and winding, filled with ferns and fallen branches. But I kept going, curious to see where it led. After what felt like an hour, the path ended at a small, hidden pond. The water was still, reflecting the dark trees around it. Something felt off about the place, a strange silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake off the weird feeling, telling myself it was just because I was alone. I decided to set up camp near the pond, thinking it would be a good place to rest. As the sun began to set, I gathered some firewood and made a small fire. The flames flickered weakly, barely keeping the darkness away. I sat there, staring into the flames, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I woke up suddenly, my heart racing. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a dim red light around the campsite. I could hear something moving in the forest, just beyond the light. It wasn't the usual sounds of animals. This was different, like something, or someone, was slowly circling my camp. I stayed as still as I could, trying to listen, but the noises stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I lay there for hours, too scared to move, until the first light of dawn started to creep through the trees. As soon as it was bright enough, I packed up and left. I didn't care where the path led, I just needed to get away from that pond. But no matter how far I walked, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The forest, which had once felt peaceful, now seemed threatening, like it was trying to trap me. By midday, I was exhausted, but I didn't stop. I followed what I thought was a trail, but it only took me deeper into the woods. The trees were so close together now that I could barely see the sky. The thought that I might never find my way out crossed my mind, but I pushed it aside, refusing to let fear take over. That's when I saw it. The pond. The same pond where I had camped the night before. I was sure I had been walking straight, but somehow, I had ended up back where I started. Panic hit me hard, and I started running, crashing through the bushes, desperate to get out. But no matter how far or fast I ran, I kept ending up back at that cursed pond. By the third time, I was ready to collapse. My legs were shaking, and my chest burned with every breath. I stood at the edge of the pond, staring into the dark water, feeling completely defeated. There was no way out. The forest had me, and it wasn't going to let me go. As the sun started to set again, I realized that I wouldn't survive another night here. The forest wasn't just watching me, it was closing in, forcing me deeper into its dark, endless woods until I had nowhere left to run. And as the last light faded from the sky, I understood something that chilled me to the bone. I wasn't going to die here, not in the way I feared. The forest would keep me alive, trapped in its never-ending loop, until I lost my mind, until I became just another part of it. Forever. I decided to go camping alone in the deep woods, far away from any path. I just wanted some peace and quiet, away from everything. The first day was exactly what I needed, silent, calm, with only the sound of the wind in the trees. I put up my tent near a small stream, thinking it was the perfect place. The second night, I woke up to a rustling sound outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But the noise didn't stop. It sounded like something or someone was moving around the campsite, slowly and carefully. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was nothing. Just the usual sounds of the forest. Then I heard it again, this time closer. It wasn't just rustling, it sounded like footsteps, slow and heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around outside the tent. There was nothing there. But the feeling that someone was nearby wouldn't leave me. I sat up, listening hard, every part of me on edge. The footsteps came again, right outside the tent. I could hear leaves crunching and twigs snapping. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. I didn't dare move. I just sat there, frozen, hoping whatever it was would go away. But it didn't. The footsteps circled the tent, slow and steady, like whoever, or whatever, it was wanted me to know they were there. I felt cold sweat run down my back as I listened to someone, or something, moving around my camp. Then, suddenly, the footsteps stopped. It was completely silent. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was my own breathing. I sat there for what felt like hours, just waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep, waking up at every little noise. In the morning, I carefully unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The camp looked normal, but something was off. There were large footprints in the dirt, human footprints, circling the tent. My stomach sank. I knew I hadn't imagined it. I quickly packed up my stuff, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling exposed and scared. I didn't want to stay there anymore. The quiet, peaceful forest had turned into something dark and scary. As I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The forest seemed too quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I finally reached my car, I felt a huge relief, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I drove off, glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. That night, back in my apartment, I still couldn't shake the feeling. It was like the forest had followed me, like something from those woods had stuck to me. I kept the lights on, locked all the doors, but the fear stayed with me. Even now, weeks later, I can't sleep well. I wake up in the middle of the night, sure I can hear those slow, heavy footsteps outside my door. The forest never let me go. It's like a shadow that won't leave, something lurking just out of sight. And deep down, I know that one day, when I least expect it, I'll hear those footsteps again. And this time, I'm not sure I'll be able to escape. I went into the forest that day because I needed a break from the non-stop noise of the city. The forest seemed like the perfect getaway with its thick trees and winding paths. The deeper I went, the more the outside world faded away, leaving me with only the peaceful quiet of nature. Or so I thought. Hours went by, and the sun began to set. Shadows stretched across the path, and the usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping and small animals moving around, disappeared. It was eerily quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to push away the growing unease in my stomach, thinking it was just the approaching darkness. I checked my map and compass, but the forest seemed to twist and turn, making it hard to figure out where I was. The trail markers were gone, and even the trees looked strange. As I kept going, I saw something odd. At random spots, there were small piles of rocks stacked in strange shapes. They seemed out of place, their neatness standing out against the messy forest floor. My heart raced as I wondered who could have made them. Night fell, and my flashlight began to flicker. I kept moving, a mix of fear and stubbornness driving me. I came across a small clearing with an old, falling-apart cabin in the center. Its windows were broken, and the door hung loosely. I felt a mix of relief and fear. It looked like it could be a shelter, but it felt like it had been abandoned for a long time. As I got closer to the cabin, I saw fresh footprints in the dirt around it. They were large and recent. My heart pounded. Someone had been here recently, someone who might still be close. I tried to calm myself and decided to check inside. The inside of the cabin was empty but surprisingly clean. There were no signs of recent use, just dust and cobwebs. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold, a stack of photographs scattered across a table. They were pictures of people, some taken in the very forest I was lost in. I looked at the photos quickly, my fear growing. The faces were all unknown to me, but each photo had a date on it, and the most recent one was from today. It hit me that these photos were tracking my movements. Panic set in. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled out of the cabin, desperate to find my way back. As I retraced my steps, the forest seemed to close in on me, the trees feeling like they were pressing in, trying to keep me there. Hours later, exhausted and almost collapsing, I finally saw the lights of the nearest town in the distance. I didn't stop to look back. The forest had taken more from me than I had expected, leaving me with a chilling reminder of how alone and vulnerable I had been. The photographs, proof that someone had been watching me and following my every move, made it clear that some parts of the forest are best left untouched. I never went back into that forest. The photographs stayed with me, a constant reminder of the forest's hidden dangers and the unsettling truth of being watched from the shadows. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The photos were a chilling hint that I wasn't alone, even when I thought I was safe. The forest seemed calm as I set up my camp for the night. I picked a spot away from the trails, under the tall pines. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the trees look even taller and darker. I built a small fire and started to relax, enjoying the quiet. But as night fell, an uneasy feeling started to creep in. I'd been in forests before, but tonight felt different. The air was thick, and the usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves and distant animal calls, seemed to be gone. Around midnight, I heard a soft sound breaking the silence. It was faint, like someone moving through the underbrush. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just animals. But the sound didn't stop, it got closer. My heart raced as I listened carefully. The sound was definitely human, deliberate and measured. Someone, or something, was getting closer to my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly stepped out of the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, showing only dense trees and shadows. I looked around but saw nothing. Just as I was about to go back to bed, I heard it again, closer this time, the crunch of leaves and twigs just beyond the edge of the light. Fear set in. I packed up quickly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My hands shook as I gathered my gear, every little noise seeming louder in the stillness. I could hear the footsteps now, clear and steady, getting nearer. I moved as fast as I could, trying to stay calm. With everything packed, I decided to leave. The path back to the car was a narrow, winding trail, and I had to navigate it in the dark. My flashlight bobbed ahead, casting eerie shadows on the trees. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. The footsteps seemed to follow me, always just out of sight but never far behind. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I stumbled along the path. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. Finally, I reached my car, fumbled with the keys, and threw everything inside. As I drove away, I glanced back at the forest. The trees stood silent and dark, hiding whatever had been following me. The feeling of dread didn't go away until I was miles down the road. I never found out who or what was in those woods with me. But a few days later, I saw something on the news. There was a report about a camper found deep in the forest, gone missing under mysterious circumstances. The details matched my location almost perfectly. The forest had kept its secrets, and I was lucky to leave before it claimed another victim. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had followed me that night was still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble into its dark embrace. The quiet, lonely forest now seemed like a place where something terrible was always lurking, ready to pounce when the sun goes down.